Hello and welcome to the KrakCast. We are delighted to welcome into the studio this week a special guest, Professor Patrick Vaughan of Jagiellonian University right here in Krakow. Patrick has agreed to speak to us about his own experiences of living and working in academia here in Krakow, but also because he was the first official biographer of the legendary Polish diplomat and political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski. Welcome to the studio, Patrick.
Oh, good to be here.
Before we start, Patrick, I was doing my research for this interview and I put your name into YouTube, and I have to ask you about this. I found an astonishing piece of footage. I expected to see you delivering a lecture, but what I see is you delivering a right hook in the West Virginia Strongman Contest. Can you please tell our listeners, A, what the hell a West Virginia Strongman is, and how a professor ends up fighting in the first round? Wait, you went farther than that, sorry.
It's the West Virginia Toughman Contest. And the Toughman Contest is a formal annual event where anybody can come and fight. And it's a 2-night event, Friday and Saturday, and you fight till you lose. And I was playing basketball once in West Virginia, and a guy saw me play, and he says, "You have good footwork. Have you ever boxed?" And I said, "No, but I like I was a big fan of boxing when I was a kid." And he says, "I'm going to teach you how to box. Come down to the gym." And he did, and it was just a way to keep in shape. But the problem was I have contact lenses, and I said I can never really spar or I can never really fight because once you lose them, you're in trouble. And he says, "That's okay, just don't get hit." And then that was his strategy. And his name was Jim March, and he's a great guy. He was sort of a philosopher, country guy, and we ended up being really close friends. And he says, one day he says, "You should fight down in this Toughman contest." He says, I said, "It'd be like George Plimpton fighting Archie Moore, I could write about it." And he goes, "Like hell, George Plimpton, you can win it." And then I said, "Man, those guys are crazy down there. Do I really want to fight these guys?" And I did. And going down there, you're backstage with 500 guys who really need the money. And West Virginia is, like John said, it's not like Massachusetts tough, man. There's some pretty...
No offense, Massachusetts, but there is some truth in what I said, though.
Yeah. Or
you maybe haven't got many backwoodsmen.
Yeah. But these guys really need the money, and I did it. It was a good experience. I got far enough. And but Michał Oleszek, who's a former student of mine, and now he's really quite high in Polish art. He's
a film critic, right?
Yeah, and he's a really good guy, and he made this. It was a simple film, but on YouTube, a simple film can get out there. So that's the story.
Can I just say that the Professor is one of the best boxing nicknames possible. It's right up there with Iron Mike.
They gave me that. This is funny. The first night they said, "What's your nickname?" And I said, "I don't have a nickname." And I said, "Everybody's got to have a nickname, buddy. It's part of the show. Give us a nickname." And I said, "Man, I don't have a nickname. I got my weight, I got my height, I gave you that. I don't have a nickname." And then the next day, when I won the previous fight, they said, "Okay, we're going to give you a nickname." And that was the Professor. And it was sort of funny. I didn't give him.
That's fantastic.
In the video, you stop a guy. It was very impressive. These are violent little contests, let me tell you, listeners. You got
that jab going really well, Patrick.
I had a good jab. Yeah, I learned that. And it was part of that idea where I just wanted to learn to fight. When the guys, he challenges you. Jim March was a trainer who wanted, he made you want to work. Like all good educators, he made you want to master a craft. And we'd throw the medicine ball and we'd talk about Abraham Lincoln's biography. He was a really smart guy, even though he never went to college. But he was a really good mentor. He would make people want to learn how to box, which is, and I learned, and I had a good jab, but I just couldn't take a punch because my contacts would fall out. In high school, my nickname was Mr. Magoo because I was so nearsighted, Yeah.
Well, I think you're being a bit hard on yourself because when you do get stopped by an ex-linebacker from the state of West Virginia's football team, you went out in your shield. You wanted to continue. So, in boxing, I'm a huge boxing fan, and fans always respect the guy who goes out in his shield.
I told the ref, he says, "Can you continue?" And I said, "I just can't see the punches." And he thought I meant that I was so hurt I couldn't see the punches, but literally I couldn't see the punches.
I guess he wanted him to say, "Hit the one in the middle."
He was just doing his job. He thought that I was really hurt, but I really wasn't. I was just blind as a bat. So
yeah,
but it all turned out okay. It was a good experience.
So at this stage, you're teaching in the West Virginia University as a history.
I teach just about everything. It's a really good program. I have a really great department where they support me and they allow me a lot of latitude what I can teach. I teach science fiction class. I teach Russian and East European literature. I teach world politics. I teach a lot of classes that, as a teacher, I remember as a student. And the philosophy I have is I want to teach the classes I would have liked to have taken when I was a student. And so I invent classes sometimes that just I think would be not only entertaining but educational for people that are 19 years old, because it's a tough audience. It's not like when I was 19 where you just got a book and you read it and took an exam. These kids now are smart. They know a lot of things just because of YouTube and Wikipedia. So you have to challenge them, and it's not easy, but I enjoy it.
And when you were a kid, what inspired you to start studying history seriously?
Well, I grew up I was born in Seattle, and most of my family roots are in Seattle. But as a young guy, I moved down to an oil town in California. It's actually called Oildale, which is not a very pleasant place. And none of my friends were really from an academic background. Most of my friends, and this is a literal truth, that most of my friends were either policemen. I mean, their parents were policemen or truck drivers or prison guards or something like that. It's the band. There's a band that actually did a song about Oildale, and it's not a very pleasant place. But my feeling was, if you have good teachers, you can live anywhere. And I had a teacher, Mrs. Adams, and when I was 10 years old, she read us 2 books. She read great books, and after lunch, when it's really hot, kids come in, you want to settle them down, and she would read to us every day. And she read 2 books. One of them was called Escape from Warsaw. It's about a bunch of feral children after Poland was invaded in 1939, and they have to do. It's a very personal story about what happens when your parents disappear during wartime, and it was a fascinating story. I remember I didn't know where Poland was, but I was 10 years old, and it just struck my imagination. And she read another one called The Endless Step, and it's about another situation where a child loses her parents. This one deported to Siberia on the Soviet side, and it was just another fascinating story. And I just right then, I think history is important because it shows you that people have had it harder than you have, and also you're not the most important person in the world. It's one of these things that I liked history for that reason. And later, there's a woman, Joan Olmsted, who was a friend of mine. I met Matt Olmsted when I was 14 years old. And Joan Olmsted, every time I would go to their house, she would give me history books. She says, this is great. And she gave me a book, and I still remember, it's called Is Paris Burning? And it's about the German occupation of Paris in World War II. And I knew Paris was still there. It didn't burn. But all through this, I was turning the pages saying, this is fascinating. And it showed me that history didn't have to be boring. It was really interesting to learn about the past because it teaches you about the present day and in some ways about the future. And Matt Olmsted, her son, ended up being a quite successful Hollywood writer. He still is. He did NYPD Blue, and he did Prison Break, which was I think a popular show even in Poland.
Yes, a very popular show. My wife loved Prison Break. I always remember when I first met her, she had the guy from Prison Break, who turned out to be gay, as her screensaver. I don't know why I bring that up now, but I just did.
If you want to know, it's funny trivia. He came to visit me in Poland. We were in the Rynek probably at 3:00 in the morning. It was when the Rynek was a little bit different. It was very quiet, and I said, "What are you working on now?" And he goes, "I'm working." And we went to high school together, and we wrote on the school newspaper together. He's actually the one who taught me how to. Encouraged me to write. He gave me a column in the college newspaper in California where I went to college, and we stayed friends. And I'm actually a character in NYPD Blue a couple times. My name.
Way.
Well, it's like this. Like Kim Delaney is interrogating a prisoner, a perp or whatever they have. It's a very, very graphic language for TV. And she says something like, do you go by your real name or you do by your alias? Patrick Vaughan, and so Matt Olmsted was a really big influence on me. But his mother was also a big influence because she told me the power of reading something besides sports, because that's mostly what I cared about as a kid. And history it became a passion for me, just learning stories about people. That's what history is. It's not really dates and war and all that sort of thing. It's just stories about people.
And may I say, your passion for sports really shined through on your H-frame videos. The Chuck Taylor one I particularly enjoyed. I was listening to it this morning. The history of the Converse All-Star. I had no idea. Yeah. So this ties into, in 1999, this was a big breakthrough in your career. You wrote the article for the Polish Review. Could you tell our listeners a bit about that and where that led to?
Well, it's funny. I and John, you can probably appreciate this. I mean, the end of the Cold War happened in 1989, and everybody said nobody really saw this coming. And if they did, it was Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher that single-handedly did this. And I thought, it's more complicated than that. And I had a college professor who hated Brzezinski. That's just, we can anglify it just because of our simplicity.
Let's make it easier for everybody.
But and I reviewed a book in college called The Grand Failure, and I disagreed with my professor. I said, listen, I know you don't like him, but if you read this book, he got it right. And then I got interested in that. He gave me a B on it. He said, I don't agree with you, but you have a pretty good argument here. And then I thought Brzezinski was one of the really interesting guys that was almost impossible to write about because it's intellectual history, it's political history, but he was hard to pigeonhole what really was he. And I decided to do an MA thesis on that, and in the process I wrote an article in the Polish Review that made some big waves. Some important people saw it, and I think they really thought I hit on something. It was a complicated article, and it's really difficult to explain, but I think Zbig, we'll call him Zbig, he appreciated it.
He wrote you a beautiful letter, which you were kind enough to just to show to me, and he basically said that you were the one guy that decoded his strategy in plain language. Would it be fair to say that was, because I am going to ask you to decode it now, sorry.
Well, if you want to hear a funny anecdotal story, I was in New York City for a conference, and it was dedicated to the 10-year anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the revolutions and everything, and they had 4 or 5 ambassadors, American ambassadors to Poland on stage. And the keynote speaker was Jan Nowak-Jagiellonian, who was the longtime legendary director of Wolna Europa, Radio Free Europe. And everybody knows him here. In fact, I think most people, if you're 20, you probably know him. His the square outside the mall is named after him. But he was a really, really big influence in Poland in the 60s and 70s as Radio Free Europe. And he was giving the keynote address. And I have to admit, I had been out late in New York City. I don't get to New York very often. And I had a friend, Ira Richmond, who I worked with in Alaska. And he lived in New York. And we went out to some country western bar in New York City until God knows when. And then the next day I was sitting in the audience and I was supposed to be alert, listening. And suddenly I hear Jan Nowak-Jagiellonian reading from a paper. He says, ambassadors are important and the State Department is important, but really the people are important and the strategy was important. And he started reading from a paper. And after about 30 seconds, I said, that's my paper. This is really interesting. And then afterwards, I went to ask him, and he says, that was you? This is you? And he invited me to his house the next week for drinks, very strong drinks. And but he was a very complete gentleman. And then the next week I got this letter from Zbig, and it was really a nice thing to get, because Brzezinski, the one thing about Brzezinski, he's a hard grader. He's a very tough guy. He's a tough critic. And the fact that he respected it meant a lot.
He was as straight as the die in all the interviews that I watched with him. I don't know. I think I'd be a bit scared if he was my professor.
He's not an easy person to talk to, but if he respects you, it's a different sort of element. A lot of people are afraid of him, and probably for good reason. He doesn't suffer fools, it's for sure. But when you get to know him, he's a little bit easier. He's a tough guy, but he always wants to know what you think. He's always challenging you.
Very precise man, from what I was saying. He enjoys conversation, but it means a lot to him, the words that are coming back and forth. Yeah. But I wanted to get you to lead us through the rest of your journey, how you end up in Krakow on the Fulbright scholarship, and how you start writing the biography, and most importantly, what it takes to take on an undertaking like that, and how it came together.
Well, let's see. There's a short story and a long story. I'll give you the medium story. I was, interested in the world, and I graduated from college, and like most 25, 24-year-old, I didn't know really what to do. And my sister had gone to Europe, and she said, you should go to Poland. And I thought, when I was in high school, Solidarity was always in the news every day. Mm-hmm. You would get it on the where I lived in high school. It's every day, what is happening in Solidarity, which was a real drama. And nobody knew how. It's easy now to say it was always going to turn out like it did, but nobody knew then. And so Poland was always in my mind. And it's a funny story. There's a race, the third race of the Triple Crown in 1990. It was the Belmont Stakes, and I gave my friend, I can't remember, like $100, and I told him to bet on these two horses. One of them was an Irish horse, Go and Go. I still remember that horse.
Go on.
Go and Go was good for me, and I read in the racing form that he was good in long distances. And I said,
myself.
I put that in an exacta box, and I forgot about it. I thought, okay, it's a gamble. What's going to happen? And my friend got back, about 8 o'clock that night. He went to off-track betting up in Northern California, and I said, hey, man, how'd it go? And he looked at me, and he started laughing, and he gave me about $1,200 in cash. He says, it came in.
Nice.
And I said, that's a Eurail ticket. I'm going to Europe. And I was in Berlin, and at that time, things were changing. It was still at East Berlin consulate, and I got a 10-day visa to Poland in 1990, and it was just really nice. It was a very different country back then, but I thought everything in Poland, everything in the 20th century happened in Poland in a big way. And if you understand Polish history, you will really understand European history, but also world history in a way. It's a very interesting place. So that's the medium story.
When you finally get the job, you've been told by Brzezinski, you're my biographer.
Yeah.
Now what kind of, I'm sure that was very intimidating, first of all, but how did you go about it? What does it take to write a biography? And especially because you were his first official biographer. There was nothing, it was unplowed turf you were going to.
It's a little bit strange because he called, I responded to his letter, obviously, and then he says, come over and, to D.C., and he works at it right by the White House. It's a think tank, and it's still there. And I went over to see him, and I could tell he was trying to size me up a little bit. You can tell when somebody, it's almost like a job interview. And after about an hour, he sort of says, okay. He has a very precise, clipped accent. He says, this is it. You can have all of the archives I have there. And at the time, they were really in almost a glorified broom closet in his office. It was really hard, but they were in cardboard boxes. And he says, do you think you can do it? And I said, well, now I don't really have a choice. I have to do this. It's one of those things where you can accept a challenge or be afraid of it. And I was kind of both, actually. And because he used to always say in his articles, he wanted Saul Bellow to write his.
Oh my goodness!
His
no
biography.
pressure then.
Yeah. and I remember leaving the office sort of intimidated in a way that I knew what I was doing for the next 5 years of my life, and it wasn't going to be easy because nothing had been written on him before, really, no official book or anything. So it's a little bit like making soup in a kitchen. It's from scratch. You have to get all the ingredients yourself. You can't just go buy a can of soup. It's you have to really put it together yourself. And also, he was a very unpopular guy in a lot of ways. In the Carter administration, he was very unpopular. He had always had unfavorable comparisons to Kissinger. So I had to put this together like a law case, like a legal case in a way. Like I had to say, I can say this is true, but I have to find some proof where my point was validated, either by a footnote or something else. It was a very difficult task, probably the hardest thing I've ever done.
I'm not surprised. I imagine it would have involved interviewing him several times as well, would it?
Oh, probably we had.
Do you have any good anecdotes from when you're in the room with the big man?
Well, he's a hard, I talked to him, several times. I probably have 800 emails from him. We had a fairly close relationship. I think he respected me and he respected my opinion. And even if I said something critical of him, I had to do that to be a real biographer. I couldn't just say, and I think he has a really sinister side on camera because he doesn't smile that much. I think when he got older, he got a little bit more personable, maybe because his daughter was in the media. And
his default face is pretty intimidating, isn't it? His at-rest face is kind of almost tough guy.
I can put it this way. If he asked you a question, you better have some reasonable thing to say. You don't want to say, I don't know. And anytime,
not acceptable.
Anytime we had a conversation, he would always spend the first 5 minutes asking me what I thought about the political situation in Poland, about the war in Iraq, whatever. He would say, so what's going on? What do you think about this? Which was unusual, but I think he did this with everybody. He kind of wanted to size them up to see where they were, and then I would ask him questions. I don't know. I probably have 30 interviews with him at least. I don't know. There were a lot of them. And after a while, we kind of got to be quite comfortable. But he's not an easy man to talk to. He doesn't suffer fools. He's an old school man. His father was an old school Polish gentleman in the diplomatic corps. He's not like talking to these people today. I mean, Ben Rhodes or some of these guys now.
Kind of more media savvy people who are concerned with how they're perceived.
Brzezinski didn't care anything about the media. In fact, he was very antagonistic towards it, which was part of his problem in the Carter administration because he couldn't sugarcoat anything. The guy would ask him a question and he would look at him and he'd say, that's a dumb question. Or he would say, don't you know anything about it? I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the Washington press is used to being coddled. Kissinger was very good at telling them, he would call them, you're the only person that can understand this. So I'm giving you this information on background. So if you can put it in the Washington Post, it would be great. And Brzezinski would just tell him, you don't know anything. You're glorified. You're like the weather or sports guy on TV. You don't really know how the world works. And that worked actually to Carter's detriment, I think, in a way, because he was so acerbic.
I think it's very important at this stage to dive in there a little bit into the Carter years when he was National Security Advisor. The 4 years of Carter's presidency were tremendously historic times. Many, many things happened. But before we talk about that, maybe you could tell our listeners a bit about détente and his relationship with Kissinger, who was the main proponent himself and Nixon, and just set up a little bit for us what was happening before Brzezinski came in 76.
It goes back. I mean, how far do you want to go back? Both of them were Eastern or Central European refugees from the war years. They both left. I mean, Kissinger left Nazi Germany in the 30s, and Zbig, his father, got a job in Montreal as a Polish statesman in Canada. So both of them left the war just before it started. So they have this in common. They both ended up at Harvard together. Both got into the establishment very early as sort of these young, ambitious Cold War academics who were very astute, very ambitious. I think Kissinger got in contact with Nelson Rockefeller, who was then running for governor of New York. And Zbig was more of a Democrat, and he got in with the Kennedy administration, or at least he wrote speeches for Kennedy. So Zbig was always on the rise. He was a very ambitious guy, very good on television at the time when that was important in the early 60s, talking about these sort of big issues. But the Carter administration, when Carter was running for office in 74 and 75, nobody knew who he was. And one of the conspiracy theories is the Trilateral Commission, which Brzezinski started with David Rockefeller in 1973, sort of handpicked Carter. They said, we can win with this guy because McGovern had just lost to Nixon 49 states to 1. And I think the rumor was that they wanted a Southerner, a Democrat, reasonable on civil rights to sort of get the Democratic Party away from this really anti-war, quite extreme party of George McGovern.
And the Trilateral Commission is where they first met. Carter was nominated by Brzezinski to come in. That's where he publicly claimed he was a fan of Brzezinski's Carter. He liked the way he approached the world. Is that fair to say?
I will tell you one thing about Brzezinski that he was really good at. And he was really good at talking to politicians. He knew how politicians, they were busy. They wanted concise information. A lot of his memos, I've seen them, they're 5 points. Just this is the thing you got to remember about Germany. This is the thing you got to remember about Japan. And I've seen his memos to Carter. They were saying, listen, I know you're a governor from Georgia. You don't really know everything about the world. And here are the big 5 things you got to know. And Carter, was a very domestic politician. He wasn't now he's known as sort of this world statesman and everything. But, in 1974, when he chose to run for president, people called him Jimmy Who. Nobody knew who he was. He was a peanut farmer in the media's eye. And Zbig, I think, and this is Carter, and I've spoken with Carter. Carter said that Zbig kind of educated him on the big deals about going on in 1975, which the Vietnam War had just ended. The Democratic Party is very to the left. The Republican Party is recovering from Watergate. They don't know who's going to run. And so it was a very unique time in history.
I mean, he had some significant achievements in office, the Camp David Accords, the normalization of relations with China, carrying on from Nixon. Do you think in some ways a lot of his achievements in office were overshadowed by the Iranian Revolution, or is that maybe a bit simplistic?
Carter... If you look at the Carter 4 years, and one of the reasons I chose to write about this is everything we're dealing with now kind of started then. Because I think in the case you mentioned, the relationship with Carter and Brzezinski was pretty interesting because Brzezinski was accused of trying to be Kissinger, to control Carter, kind of like, that Brzezinski was sort of alone in that administration. Most of the administration was staffed by people that were very critical of Vietnam. And Zbig was sort of the one hawk remaining in the Democratic Party in 1977 when it was very unfashionable to be a hawk. But Brzezinski went into 1977 with 5 or 10 goals he said needed to be achieved in this very transitional period in world history, 1977 to 81. It was very important. And I think part of the reason that Iran is such a big deal in the Carter administration is nobody saw this coming. Nobody saw sort of religion is a driving force for a revolution, especially with young people. Religion in 1975 was seen as something from the 19th century. Nobody saw this. And I think Brzezinski really did see it. But he told Carter he's got to be tough. Mm-hmm. And you got to be tough, and you got to be cold-hearted, and you got to do almost a military takeover, or the Shah's going to lose. And the Shah was getting conflicting information from the State Department, and I think most of the media blamed Zbig for that.
But he was having a bit of a war with Cyrus Vance at the time, wasn't he? Who I kind of blame a bit more than...
Among many, right?
Yeah.
He and Vance were part of the old establishment, but they were completely different people. Vance was a gentlemanly lawyer, very waspy. Zbig was an ambitious, strategic thinker. And the Iran thing was really the end of the Carter administration. There were a lot of them in 1979, but the image of Iranian hostages on TV every night really
the failed
hurt.
Rescue attempt as well.
Yeah, and that was Zbig's idea. He thought that you can't just sit there and do nothing. Let's try it, and it ended in failure. And it really showed that Carter was one of these guys that he had these symbols of weakness where he put himself in that situation. He tried to run a 5K race, for example, in Washington, D.C. He didn't finish. He fell down. And
he got attacked by a rabbit while swimming in the river.
The rabbit.
5Ks he couldn't finish.
Or maybe it was a 10K. Apologies.
But attacked by a rabbit, Dave.
Yeah, well, rabbits can be vicious, John, okay?
That's true too.
Especially West Virginia
10K is a long way, so I don't know.
That story is actually, there's some truth in that. And it was
Which one? The rabbit?
The rabbit story. And all of these...
Now we're getting weird here.
It's not.
Let's go down the rabbit hole.
One of the things that hurts a president is when...
Getting attacked by rabbits.
Well, when the jokes start to go on late night television, like
exactly.
Johnny Carson. When you get...
Yeah, this is early days of Chevy Chase and SNL and whatnot.
And Carter... I mean, Dan Aykroyd did a great Jimmy Carter on Saturday Night Live. And Carter... One of the things that was a handicap of the Carter administration is Carter never really fought back. He never got angry.
Yeah.
And I think that was a liability in a politician. He just took the abuse, I think, and because he's a gentleman. He's a really nice guy. I've talked to Carter. He's a very, very good guy. But in politics, sometimes, especially when you're going against Ted Kennedy from the Democratic side or Ronald Reagan, it's tough to win. And I think people respected Reagan in 1980 because he just told it plainly, and people kind of liked Reagan's simple message. Let's get stronger,
Would it be fair to say around this time Brzezinski developed some serious misgivings about the direction of the Democratic Party?
Yeah, I think that's very, very... I mean, he always had it, but he wasn't... I think domestically he was always sort of a Democrat. He was a Kennedy-Truman Democrat. He was, he liked Harry Truman as a young guy, and I think by the 1979, 1980, most of the Democratic Party really welcomed that Kennedy challenged to Carter, which was suicidal for the Democratic Party. When Ted Kennedy, who was the last of the Kennedy
brothers, never going to win either, Chappaquiddick and
never going to win, but he challenged Carter, it completely wounded Carter, and Zbig was really angry about a lot of staffers, even in the Carter White House, he thought were sympathetic to Kennedy. It was a fratricidal. The Democrats are always fratricidal.
I think this is a good place for me to jump in with the big question that I have. Thinking about this last night, doing some research, I kept coming across a fundamental, I guess, very, very basic question about Brzezinski. Now it's my
turn. Just anglicize it, John.
Zbig.
Zbig's role in domestic American politics. Now, a bit of a warning. I've got an introduction to this question, kind of background.
No problem. Yeah,
you're going to see this question coming from a mile away, I think.
We're all friends here.
I think Dave is going to try to shut me down long before I get to where I want to go.
Okay.
Which is just what he does. So, Josh, if Dave starts talking, just cut his microphone, okay? Okay, 1933, let's go back. 1933, one of his first, I think maybe his very first diplomatic act in office, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, Democratic icon, diplomatically recognizes the Soviet Union, right? Uncle Joe Stalin, murderer of 10 million people before World War II started, right?
Yeah.
His successor, Harry Truman, under his presidency, we saw the Chinese Communist Revolution, right? In large part because American support for the Chinese nationalists was withdrawn, right? So Red China rises, 50 million dead over the coming decades. Another Democratic icon, JFK, John Kennedy. Under his presidency, I think he caved into Soviet pressure, took American missiles out of Turkey. We lost the space race. The Berlin Wall goes up. 1976... Jimmy Carter, Zbig's political benefactor. He won the presidency with, this is true, 50.1% of the vote.
It was an aberrational win.
50.1. Now, this is amazing given this is in the immediate aftermath of Watergate, right? The immediate aftermath of another controversy people forget about, which was Ford's pardon of Nixon. So the public is enraged against Republicans, and Carter still only wins 50.1%. So it gives you an idea of the damage that the McGovern Democratic Party did to themselves, really. So anyway, wait, I'm still not there yet.
No, that's all right.
So by the time Jimmy Carter comes in office, there aren't that many places left on the globe where the communists were not already in charge, right? So, but they did come to power in Nicaragua and Grenada. That's America's backyard, right? Also, as you mentioned earlier, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. There was a 1977 speech, I think a commencement speech at some university where
Notre Dame.
Jimmy Carter famously said that Americans had an inordinate fear of communism. Inordinate fear of still not there. Wait, Patrick, still not there. Almost there.
It's all right.
So Ronald Reagan takes office. In his 8 years, not a single country on the planet switched to a communist government. In 1986, at the Reykjavik summit, he famously walks away from the table. He's Gorbachev sitting there crying, I guess. 3 years later, the Soviet Union is in pieces. And since then, the only place you can find communists is in American university faculty lounges, I think. So this is all a very, very, very roundabout way of getting to my question, which is, did Zbig ever consider that maybe he was on the wrong team?
Okay.
And don't forget, one more thing. Going back to FDR, FDR sold out his own Poland at Yalta.
Well,
Delivered it to Stalin on a platter. Did Zbigniew never think,
Usually the question mark is the end point, John.
How much more obvious can it be? It's super obvious to me. How in the world is he a Democrat?
Okay. See if I can take these.
Okay, I'll calm down now.
See if I can take these one at a time.
There's
He's not used to not talking for this.
There's a lot there.
Sorry about that. So I'm probably been talking too much. But
not at all.
I think that, first of all, Zbig, you would have to understand his childhood. His father was very unusual that he was Polish representative first to Nazi Germany in 1933, and in 1936 he went to Stalin's Russia. So I think of all of the people in the world, Zbig got an education as a child listening to his father talk about how, and he later wrote this in a famous essay, how the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were essentially the same, even if they claimed to be ideological polar opposites. And Zbig and his father gave him a very good education. Zbig told me many stories about how his father would go to some event in the Soviet Union in 1937, and the person that he had lunch with disappeared. So nobody in the Democratic Party, I think, understood the Soviet Union better than Zbig and Cotton and all of these events that you talk about with the Yalta. They were personal events to Brzezinski because he couldn't go home. These were not sort of abstractions, academic abstractions, like they were to a lot of Cold War academics. They were personal things that changed his life dramatically, and he was very anti-Soviet, and he was accused of being a Polish nationalist in this respect. But I think Brzezinski understood communism better than almost anybody in the American foreign policy establishment because, first of all, he spoke the language. He knew Polish history, he knew Russian history very well. He's a historian. He's not just sort of a dabbling in some of this. He's a very astute scholar of Russian history, and he always said that the Russians needed to be stopped, and the Russians didn't respect weakness, they respect strength. So I think he respected Harry Truman, and he didn't respect very much FDR at Yalta. He's very critical of FDR at Yalta, but he liked Truman, the Marshall Plan, NATO, and how Truman talked to the Soviets was very different than Roosevelt.
Threatened to H-bomb them the minute he got into office, didn't he? You know?
Yeah, and Truman was a different kind of Democrat than...
That's why John didn't mention him.
Yeah,
No, I did.
Yeah.
Communist revolution on his watch in China.
But
50
really,
million dead.
I know, but China
How can you stop that?
It was a difficult situation. I mean, it's China was going to do what China was going to do.
Exactly.
There's nothing that really could be done, probably. I think probably there was some idealism in the American foreign policy establishment towards Mao early on, but I think everybody had that in the sort of intellectual classes that communism would work if it was just corrected. There was a lot of that in the American intellectual classes that as soon as the bad things get corrected, the Soviet Union will work. Zbig never thought that. He was
One day. We don't know when, but one day.
Zbig was one of the few Cold War academics who said it's totalitarian, and if it's not totalitarian, it's going to decay, it's going to fall apart because it just can't exist as a system. It's against all of the aspects of human nature. It's very...
no one would choose these details.
Yeah, and he knew, he said this is their weakness, and the weakness was its Soviet nationalities. He was talking about it in the 60s when nobody was talking about that. He basically predicted the implosion of the Soviet Union in the 1960s when people laughed at him. I talked to Richard Pipes, who just died. He's another Polish historian from Harvard, and he said he and Zbig tried to tell this Lyndon Johnson State Department that the Soviet Union was going to collapse along nationalist lines in 1966 or 67, and everybody just started laughing at them. You know, that the Soviet people were a single entity. They were Soviet, and they said, you don't understand history. This is a empire of conquered nationalities that are really angry. If they get a chance, they might, and this was the weakness. He called it the Achilles heel. So he was not just a Democrat. I think that he felt not at home in the Democratic Party, especially in the 70s and 80s. And in 1984, he endorsed Reagan. And
in 88, he endorsed Bush, John.
So he did change teams
he
eventually.
changed
he
teams,
did,
yeah.
Maybe 40 years too late, but he did.
And he said Reagan listened to him. He wrote a book in the 1980s called Game Plan, and Reagan read it. And there's a lot of letters from Zbig and Reagan going back and forth. And I think Reagan liked how Zbig put these, what you said, very complicated issues kind of simplistically,
And also, John, let's not forget, he got the rabbit hater Jimmy Carter himself to sign in the Carter Doctrine, which basically pledged the United States to military action. Am I correct? In the Middle East,
Brzezinski wrote the Carter Doctrine. Yeah, he wrote the Carter Doctrine, which some people
very strong.
There's a lot of very respectable academics. Andrew Bacevich, for one, who says the Carter Doctrine was the start of all of the troubles that we have now.
But I was going to say, we can see how well the Carter Doctrine worked out in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, Brzezinski...
Nothing but peace.
Yeah, I think Brzezinski was afraid of the Soviets in 1980, had a long-term plan.
Which they did, John, to take over the Straits.
Well, to eventually... Because if you look at the Soviet Union in 1500, where it was in 1950, it's the largest terrestrial empire in global history. I mean, the Soviet Union was giant, and it didn't get 11 time zones or 12 or 13 time zones by being nice to its neighbors. And I think Brzezinski said they're trying to do the same thing in the Persian Gulf, and if they do it, we're going to be really in trouble. Japan, Western Europe, and America depend on this. And whether you like it or not, we have to fight back, because if we don't, the Soviets smell weakness, and they will try to do this. I mean, Tom Clancy wrote a novel, Red Storm Rising, about this exact scenario in the 1980s, saying if the Soviets have problems with their petroleum, which they were in the 1980s, they might just take the Persian Gulf, not because they're nice or not because, you know, it's to their advantage, but because they can. And that would be to their advantage if there's no counterforce there. The Middle East is very complicated in the 70s. It was really complicated.
It is very much so. But the point I was making more is just that he emboldened Carter to be strong on it. You know, he kind of puffed him up to say, come on, Jimmy, let's do this.
The constant battle between Vance and Brzezinski was that Brzezinski said the Soviets respect strength and they don't respect concessions. They don't respect niceties. You have to be tough with them, because if they sense weakness, they will just push you and push you and push you. And that was one reason he opened to the Chinese. Deng Xiaoping was a very different leader than Mao Zedong in 1977 and 78. And Brzezinski says, hey, listen, we got a chance. We got a window here to open to China. The Chinese are more anti-Russian than we are. And therefore, there's this triangulation, which was more significant than even Nixon Kissinger, in that it was consummated in 1979. And China was almost an associate member of NATO in a way, and people forget that in the late 70s and 80s. You know. So,
yeah, and that actually leads me to something I nearly forgot to ask you about, which is the Cold War ends. Brzezinski advocates NATO strengthening, but he has in his mind, am I correct in saying this, a vision where you show Russia, he wasn't finished with Russia, he knew that Russia would re-strengthen and come back, that the 90s were the aberration, that there wasn't the end of history. This is another thing he saw very clearly.
If you see this, you know, and if you look at Brzezinski, he made a famous speech. He traveled to Russia and Soviet Union in 1989, 2 weeks before the Berlin Wall fell, and he was talking to the Soviets. What are you going to do about Germany? Because the German question was always, that was the post-war Cold War question. What are you going to do about Germany? And the idea was to tuck it into NATO and hope that it develops into sort of a normal state. The lingering question after 1989 is, what are you going to do with Russia? What's it going to be? Is it going to be a revanchist state trying to reclaim its empire, or is it going to be what Brzezinski always called the community of developed nations? And he thought, there's a very narrow window to bring Russia into this family of states, but in the meantime, you better extend NATO. He was talking about extending NATO very early. And the Bush administration was in Iraq in 1990. It lost track of all these things, but Central Europe was very important for him.
Yeah, I mean, it's something in one of the books I read by him, he just focuses on it endlessly, the geostrategic importance of Central Europe. You know, it was something that he was...
I think
very strong on.
One of the things about Brzezinski, always knew that American politicians had very short memories and they didn't know history. And the Russians did, and the Chinese did. And he was always trying to tell American politicians, listen, the Chinese think in 5,000-year historical cycles, and the Russians have very long-term ambitions. You better extend NATO, at least so you don't let Poland become this dangling sort of temptation in the middle of Central Europe, because that vacuum has always been filled, and usually not by nice people.
Absolutely.
Did he not see a downside to NATO expansion as a kind of poking the bear, so to speak, moving NATO right up to its doorstep?
He was one of the few guys, and if you want to know who really was the founder, I think, of expanding NATO, there's a big debate between Strobe Talbot in 1993 and Zbig from the outside, and Zbig was Madeleine Albright's professor at Columbia, so he had some insight in the Clinton administration. And the Clinton administration came in 93 saying, we don't want to expand NATO. We don't want to poke the bear. It will be like, it would be provocative. And Brzezinski says, listen, if you don't do it now, you can never do it. And he's very in touch with Polish politicians. One thing about Brzezinski, he was very in touch with Polish politicians always at the highest levels. And he was, and I don't think Clinton and Carter were. They didn't understand this part of the world. I think Brzezinski did.
Just a quick devil's advocate question.
Yeah, here. Sure. And there are plenty of them.
Could you make, again, devil's advocate, could you make the argument that as a Pole, that Zbig's interpretation of Russia and its motives was a little exaggerated, maybe a little paranoid, a little tinged with a bit of Polish paranoia that kind of characterizes even contemporary politics.
He was saying this in the 90s. Look what's happening now.
I think Brzezinski knew the Russians better than the Russians knew themselves. I think he was one of these guys who said, he said the Russians should be happy to be a state and not an empire. And he said this famously in 1994 when the Ukrainian situation is Russian can be an empire and a democracy can be both. And he was very, very a vocal proponent in the early 90s when nobody was paying attention to this. Most of the news was saying, there's a McDonald's in Red Square. Everything is over. It's the Fukuyama idea. And he says, God. No, he says, you have to cement these gains because he was a child of Yalta. He was a child of Tehran. He was a child of Munich. He remembers these things as historical personal memories. And he didn't want to see this happen again. And he was very in touch in the Clinton administration and talking about, listen, NATO expansion, enlargement, whatever you want to call it, is going to be unpopular and it might provoke the Russians, but it's better than the alternative of letting Central Europe dangle out there in the middle of no man's land, because anybody who was born in 1928 had seen that before. What happens when Central Europe is a vacuum?
And let's not forget, John, right up to 1999, Vladimir Putin himself had publicly talked about Russia being an associate member of NATO. So it's only in recent years that's become something that's seen as a given. You don't poke the bear. It's become the poke the bear argument is back now, but we hadn't seen it for a long time. I want to touch on, before we finish, on his legacy in relation to Poland, Patrick. What do you think are the most important things he did just for Poland? His achievements that kind of helped this country become the flourishing nation state that we see today.
Well, he's got a complicated legacy. I mean, there's a lot of people that if you Google him, he's the New World Order.
Oh, God, yeah.
And it's...
apparently the earth is flat as well, so we won't give them the time of day.
But, I mean, conspiracy theories, I don't want to just dismiss this New World Order conspiracy out of hand, because it will keep you up at night if you go down too much into that. But to be honest, a lot of intellectuals in 1900 were for this world government. H.G. Wells, if you watch this fantastic science fiction movie, and I use it in my class, Things to Come, talking about how the world government has to take over for technology and health reasons, and then you can't just live in villages your whole life. So I think one of the things that you see on the internet about Brzezinski is that he was for this New World Order. But if you look at somebody born in 1900, if you look at them in 1950, what was the old New Order? It was the French and the Germans going to war every generation. The Russians, 2 world wars, the 1930s depression. So the idea was to formulate a new international system. And I think his biggest legacy for Poland is to get Poland out of the Soviet orbit and to bring it first slowly into Central European family. He was talking about this in the 1950s. And then later, they called it bridge building. He wrote a famous speech for Lyndon Johnson in 1966 talking about bringing Poland, linking it into Europe proper, because Poland was part of the West, not part of the East. Mm-hmm. You can see it in the culture. Poles consider themselves part of the West, not the East.
Yeah, I made that mistake when I first got here. Eastern Europe, they don't like that.
Yeah. Well, and I think Brzezinski understood this, and he also understood the weakness of the Polish communist system. He always said, Poland, the old joke was that Poland is like an onion. It's red on the outside and white on the inside. And the idea is to emphasize that white, but not to make it too nationalistic, because anytime you get nationalism to an excess, it's dangerous. And I think but he's caught in the middle of that,
And he was awarded the Order of the White Eagle in 1995. He has the highest civilian honor in both the United States and in Poland. So, even though, as you say, there are many people who disagreed with him throughout his life, I thought it was great to see him honored such. John, have you any more questions for Patrick?
Go ahead.
Yeah, just what would he say to people like me who think... Why is that funny? I don't know. What would he say to people like me who think... that America should stop fighting the world's wars, or at least fighting them without issuing an invoice?
Well, I think he would enjoy talking to you. Actually, he enjoys talking. One of the good things about Brzezinski is he has this sort of austere presence on television, but his son told me the story where he would have a friend over from the cross-country team in high school, and it would just be a guy from high school, and all of a sudden he would go and leave the room, and he would come back, and Brzezinski's talking to this kid from 17 years old about dual-use nuclear technology or something. You know? but yeah, Dad, come on, stop bugging my friends, man. You know. But I think one of the things that Brzezinski was always good at is he understood the oppositional arguments, and I think he would agree with you in a lot of respects. He was, like I said, he was one of the firm voices in August of 1990 against going to war in Iraq. He said that's going to be a mess. You don't know how it's going to end, and once you get into war in the Middle East, you don't know anything. And there's nothing worse than being stuck in the Middle East with all of these troops in Saudi Arabia because you don't know what's going to happen.
But at the same time, he's also an anti-pacifist.
I think he's a strategic thinker. He thinks war is the last best option, and he was against the war in 2003, and everybody laughed at him. He was talking in 2002.
He said you're kicking the hornet's nest, didn't he?
He just says, don't do this. You don't know what you're getting into. And he says, there's ways to respond to 9/11. Going to war is not one of them, because once you get in there, you lose all track of almost everything. And war is inherently unstable. It's not a conservative policy, it's a radical policy. And he was very, people forget about that. He was a very, very strong advocate of staying out of the Middle East if you can possibly do it. In 1990,
we say, speak softly, but carry a big stick.
Let me just quickly back up to a little bit of ground. We covered a little bit already. I have to know, though, did he ever advocate a first strike against the Soviet Union or any kind of military aggression against them?
There's some really interesting story about that. I don't think he ever... his policy, and he's told me this personally, we've had a lot of conversation, his policy was to dismantle the Soviet Union, but without war. There were ways to do it, encouraging nationalism, human rights. The Carter administration was the first administration to talk openly about human rights, people like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn. And part of that, almost all of that, was Brzezinski, because the Carter State Department wanted nothing to do with that. And Brzezinski said, this is the weakness of the Soviet Union, the human rights aspect. And we can push that, because if we don't, we're just, we're conceding.
So socially, culturally, diplomatically, maybe economically, but not militarily.
Not militarily, because military, listen, I think one of the things that Brzezinski understood about the communist world, China, but also Eastern Europe and also the Soviet Union, was Eastern Europe was the weak link in the Soviet Empire, and he knew a lot about Poland, and he handled solidarity very well when it broke out in August of 1980. And I don't think even Reagan understood what was happening in solidarity, but Brzezinski did. He understood everything. And he was communicating with Richard Kuklinski. And this is another untold story of the Cold War that nobody really talked about, but Poland was the linchpin in everything in the 1970s. It was this between the Soviet Union and Germany, and it was so important. And he handled it, I think, in my opinion, much better than most American politicians who couldn't point to Poland on the map. And he knew its history, he knew its culture, he knew its language, he knew the people in charge, and he could pick up the phone and talk to Jaruzelski, or he could talk to these people. He knew, Jaruzelski and him, I think his brother and Jaruzelski went to the same high school. So you can talk about that. Carter would say, what does that mean? And Brzezinski said it means a lot. So the fact that he knew Poland was really important.
He had a hell of a Rolodex. Do people still have Rolodex? I don't think so. But, whatever the modern equivalent of Rolodex is.
David Rockefeller was the one who had the famous Rolodex with, it was as big as a room-sized Ferris wheel, and I think now everybody's just got a smartphone, so nobody even knows what a Rolodex is. But Rockefeller was big in that. But I can tell you the one Jimmy Carter story that I was going to tell you about.
Please do.
About my friends came to visit, and I don't know how, 10 years ago, and they'd never been to Poland, and they got into trouble, as most people do on their first night here when they stayed out too late.
That's strong beer.
And I still remember this story where I said, well, I got to get up early. And they said, why do you got to get up early? Stay out with it. I said, I got to get up kind of early. And then the phone rang, and these guys were really they got in maybe an hour earlier. It was probably daybreak, and the phone rings, and I put it on speakerphone so I can record it, and it's Jimmy Carter, and these guys have the worst hangovers they've ever had, and they listen to this conversation with Carter in my apartment on Florianska, and they kind of go, is that the real Jimmy Carter? It's like, and they thought they were having this terrible, but it was one of those great experiences. Writing a book about Brzezinski was a great experience. You learn almost everything about the 20th century through this one person, which was great about writing a biography. Well, and I can tell you about Brzezinski that a lot of people don't know. He was nice to people who worked for him. If you ask anybody who's ever worked with him or his students, they respect him. And even if he wasn't easy, he was tough. And I think we miss that in academia now. I think we really miss that. I think we really miss the tough sort of, you got to be a critical thinker. You should think tough, and his expectations were unusually high. And I think that was the best thing about him.
Why not? These are some of the finest educational institutions in the world. To me, I never went to university. I'm shocked that people don't get F's and D's in Columbia anymore. This was strange.
But he would do one thing that Madeleine Albright told me the story, because she was his student. If you got an A in his class, you knew you really deserved it, because he would write a personal letter, 2 or 3 pages long, on why you got an A in his class.
Wow.
And he would do that every year. And that means
that's more than
it's probably pretty rare. Yeah. And Madeleine Albright said that's her most treasured possession, because she knew she earned that. And that was at Columbia in the early 60s, So I think he's an interesting guy. He's a controversial guy. I know people can Google him right now and probably have nightmares about what they see. But I think it's a complicated 20th century, and he was at the vortex of this, being in Polish kid. He was born in 1928 in Warsaw. You can think that's 10 years after Poland, emerged on the map after 123 years. It's a very interesting time in history. And I think as well, Kissinger suffered from this as well. I mean, if you spend your whole career making difficult calls on the most complicated subjects in the world, you're of course going to have a body of work that people can then come along 20, 30, 40 years later and throw rocks at. There was a twinkle in the man's eye. There was one interview I found when he was Morning Joe is his daughter, and Mika, she's a big star now. And,
that's right. Yeah. She's leading the anti-Trump war bands on morning TV. But in this clip, I was just watching some different interviews with him, and there's a great moment at the end where she says, "So see you at Thanksgiving, Dad." And Brzezinski, the eyes twinkling away, just responds, "And yes, I will be there for dinner. And then I will be leaving. I will not be staying for 2 days like you asked. You know I'm busy."
He's a tough guy, and he's a straight shooter. And boy, if you get on his bad side, he can be cold. But he respects intellect. I think he respects intellectual argument. Or he's respected. He's passed now for a year now. But I think he was really, Richard Burt, who wrote for the New York Times in the 1970s. He said, Brzezinski is a national treasure for America because they didn't know really what they had, because he understood the world at a time when most Americans either didn't care about the world in the 1960s because they thought the world was always going to be cooperative. But that's a controversial point. But he said Brzezinski was the one American statesman, and Kissinger, but Brzezinski understood the future. He wrote a book in 1970 about coming technology. He predicted the internet. You can read this book, and he's talking about computers talking to each other, how it's going to change the world because poor nations are going to know that they're poor, and they're going to want to rise up against it, and there's going to be a backlash against America and the West in general, and we better start thinking about that. And most people at that time were thinking about the Soviet Union in 1970. Brzezinski said the Soviet Union is not going to be around in 20 years, and everybody laughed at that. But if you read that now, it looks really prescient. It looks like he understood what was going to happen. And so, people can call this the New World Order or whatever you want to call it, but he saw this coming. I mean, nobody was talking about the Soviet Union collapsing in 1970 like he was. So he was a guy that saw things ahead of his time. He was really a gentleman. He was tough. but not everybody likes them. But that's the world we live in. Not everybody likes everybody, and maybe that's part of the problem. You know?
Well, I think after people listen to this, they're at least going to understand the man a lot better, Patrick.
Yeah.
It's been absolutely fascinating to have you in the studio.
It's been a pleasure.
We've been talking for almost an hour, and I still feel like we've just scratched the surface here. Maybe this is a good opportunity for us to put you on the spot and make you promise to come back sometime.
Hey, listen, and I just watched France beat Uruguay, and so it's. I guess I'm giving away the date when we're.
That's okay,
this, but it's been a pleasure. You guys, I think you're doing a great thing here. I think one of the things about Poland, living here, it's not easy. I came here 20 years ago when it was less easy. Mm-hmm. And I think you guys are doing a great thing here. Just and this is the new world we live in, where you can have your own sort of media operation and create a niche. And
so we're going to take that as a yes, that you're going to come back.
I'm going to come back.
There's so many subjects you've touched on. I mean, you're an expert in everything. It's unbelievable.
I just really appreciate it. I think you guys, my student that you interviewed.
Super Tim Dan, big shout out to Super Tim for recommending us to try and get in touch with Patrick.
Well, another guy we want to have back.
He was a former student of mine, and it shows you how Poland is changing. That an Indian student, he was the best. Just a great student, and he just, and
he just made his day now.
Yeah,
he calls you the prof, right?
The prof. He always calls me the prof. But it also shows you there's a generational change where in Poland, an Indian guy can come here and do the job. I'm not going to say what he does, but you can just say.
He's a sex toy guy. Okay. We know that.
All right. Maybe this is a good time to end it. So, all right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, and goodbye, listeners.
And remember, that's Patrick, the Professor Vaughan.
And check out the H-frame if you can put it.
We're going to put a link up there and a few more links to your exceptional working career.
Yeah, I think I'm getting about 52 views on some of those videos, and somebody told me that's bad.
So. Yeah, it's more than us.
Okay.